Hi, everyone, and welcome back for part 2 of chapter 3 on perception in Psych 4100. This last part of chapter 3 is going to start off with a discussion of what's known as perceptual organization. We'll talk about that for, I think, the majority of this part of the lecture, and then we'll end the lecture with a little bit on how perception and action are sort of intrinsically tied together. So, the sort of old view on perception is that perception involves just adding up the data of sensation. So you tick all the boxes, you add up all the sensations, and then you can, that's how we produce a perception. A sort of new perspective, new quote unquote, as in like, starting in the 60s and the 70s, is something called Gestalt Psychology or Gestalt organizing principles. This basically says that the mind organizes information according to certain principles, that there are existing frameworks in the mind within which data are attempted to be fit to those frameworks. So there are principles that your mind follows when it tries to organize the information from the world. This is another example of bottom-up, meaning sensations, data from the world, meeting a sort of top-down organizational structure that produces your perception. So, for example, this image on the right of this woman that's made out of sort of gray dots. In the old view called structuralism, you would basically say, well, the brain is just sort of calculating the location of each dot, and it adds them all up and it produces a face. Well, the Gestalt view sort of brings this perspective that that these dots are perceived along certain organizational principles, such as the fact that these dots that make up her eyebrows are very, very close together. So what ends up happening is that your brain treats all of these individual dots as if it's one item, right? A single eyebrow, rather than your brain treating it as individual dots. For example, that's one type of organizing principle. The same thing could be said for these sort of dots that make these creases around her mouth. These aren't as close together, right? But what they do is they share this sort of shape, right? This arc. They're aligned with each other. And so thus your brain says, ooh, those things go together. And it perceives them as sort of an element of the picture. So I guess a way that you could describe in an analogy, Gestalt principles, is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So the sum of the parts, just adding up all the dots, doesn't quite capture the way your brain actually organizes this information, right? The whole, the sort of big picture, is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what Gestalt psychology is going to show us. So we're going to go through 5 of these Gestalt organizing principles, the first of which is good continuation. So let's look at this picture on the left of this rope that's all coiled up and wrapped up. When your brain sees this rope, it does not interpret it as a bunch of individual segments of rope. So, for example, it's possible, right, because of the way that the retinal image is sort of ambiguous, it's possible that this segment of rope that I'm highlighting with my pointer right here, it's possible that this segment of rope is just a cut piece of rope and is just sitting by itself and it's not connected to any of the other rope. Right? That's possible because it's occluded by another segment of rope. So it is perfectly possible that this is its own cut off piece of rope that's disconnected from the rest of the rope. But that's not how your brain perceives it. Your brain perceives this as a continuous flow of the same piece of rope Because your brain tends to see lines as following the smoothest path possible. So because these segments of rope sort of follow in the same trajectories, your brain goes, oh, okay, those things go together, right? This is just one long piece of rope. It's not teeny tiny little cut up segments. So this principle, this organizing principle of that lines follow the smoothest path in the real world is called good continuation. Our second organizing principle is called the law of pragnance. To be a little easier to pronounce and easier to understand, we can also call this the principle of simplicity or good figure. I think good figure is also kind of weird and ambiguous. I prefer the principle of simplicity. Basically, your brain perceives and you perceive stimulus patterns as resulting from the most simple structure possible. So you perceive patterns of stimuli as resulting from the most simple structure possible. So let's look at this example on the right. At the top, we have this figure of circles that's basically like the Olympic rings signal or symbol, but without colors. And what you perceive these as is 5 sort of interlocking, overlapping circles, right? That's how we see this. Although, again, it is perfectly plausible that B is the case, that this is just a bunch of weird little shaped segments that all kind of happen to fit together, right? It's perfectly possible that this is 5 circles, and that's how we perceive it because that's the most simple way to perceive it. But it's also perfectly possible that this is actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 separate kind of funky, weird shaped curving objects. So the fact that your brain ignores the possibility of B and automatically jumps to the possibility of A is known as the principle of simplicity, the law of pragnance, or the good figure organizing principle. Our third principle is the principle of similarity. Basically, things that are similar go together. They get grouped together. So here in A, we perceive this really as a square of circles, right? You don't perceive this as vertical lines of circles. What you perceive this as, the sort of sense, the feeling that you get from it, is of a square, right? A single shape. It's just made up of other smaller shapes that are all sort of organized evenly together. But we perceive this whole thing kind of as being one object. Versus if we take vertical lines of this structure and we change some of the colors, let's make 3 of these vertical lines blue. Now what you do is you perceive this as, well, a vertical line of blue circles, then a vertical line of red circles, a vertical line of blue circles, a vertical line of red circles. Now the object becomes lines of circles. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 objects, because the fact that all of these are red means they go together and that they are not going with this line of blue circles. The line of blue circles is independent, it's distinct, it's its own object, because these things are similar to one another and they're not similar to the red circles. So, principle of similarity, things that are similar get grouped together in perception. Here's another example of grouping. So this woman happens to have on, I'm sure this is on purpose, happens to have on an outfit that sort of the colors exactly mimic the distinction between the sand and sort of the foam of the water as it washes up on the sand, and then the sort of aquamarine color of the ocean itself. And so what we end up doing is grouping, for example, her blouse with the ocean, her sort of white undershirt with the foam, and her brown skirt with the sand. So Gestalt psychology argues that these organizing principles are intrinsic, meaning they're built in. You don't have to learn these. Experience has an impact, right? In your past behaviors and knowledge obviously have a top-down influence on perception. But for these organizing principles, there's not much you can do about it. It's kind of hardwired into the brain. Experience can influence perception, they argue, but it's not the main driver. Another couple of these organizing principles that are fun to look at. This one is known as Figureground because it has to do with what parts of the picture you perceive to be in the foreground versus what parts of the picture you perceive to be in the background. So this is sort of a classic visual illusion, a flipping of perception, in fact. So this is one image, but you can perceive it in two ways. And I think the easiest way to see both perceptions is to focus on this structure right here in the picture. Now, I want you to imagine that this is the jawline and chin and then sort of face of a young woman looking away from you with sort of a big fancy hat on or something. This black is her hair. This sort of billowing white is like a fancy hat or a cape. This is some little curly Q thing she's got going on at the front of her head. These are her shoulders, and she's got sort of like a mink coat on or something, right? This is her neck. She's got this slender neck. This is her jawline up to her face. That's her ear. Here's her hair. And she's looking away from you. So what you're doing is you're perceiving this object as being sort of in the background, right? It's behind. Now I want you to think of that same part of the image as being in the foreground, except now it's a nose. It's a nose. This is an eye. This is an eye. This is a mouth. And what you see is an old woman looking down with her her chin and her mouth sort of tucked into the top of her chest. And then this is like her shawl over her head as well as her coat. So by adjusting your perception of this piece of the image, you can sort of flip back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And again, this, in addition to showing us the Figureground illusion or the Figureground organizing principle, this illusion shows us the impact of top-down processing on perception. You can, with your mind, do magic, right? You can change the way you perceive the same stimulus. Right? Nothing is changing about the picture. The data coming into your brain is the same. It's not changing at all. What's changing is the way you think about the data, and your thoughts about the data change the way you perceive it. So there's no correct answer here, right? Is it the young woman or is it the old woman? It's both. It depends, right? And this is a cool kind of perceptual visual illusion, but if you really dig into it, I mean, this has very sort of heavy philosophical implications for the way that humans interact with the world. It basically means that there is no objective way to prove what's out there in the world, because everything that you think about, everything you perceive, is filtered through a subjective lens of interpretation. That's not something we're going to get into so much in this class, but just a little food for thought that even something as seemingly simple as Chapter 3 in cognitive psychology can actually have pretty profound implications for things like your philosophical worldview. Another example of Figureground, you can perceive this as Wolverine, the comic book character, looking straight at you, right? So these are Wolverine's eyes. This is the top of Wolverine's head. Here's some little mask thing he's wearing. Here's his mouth. These are Wolverine's shoulders, and this is Wolverine's chest. Now, to make it look like Wolverine, you basically have to think about the orange parts of this picture as being in the foreground, right? They are a part of the figure. They're a part of Wolverine. But you can flip this perception and make it look like two Batmen who are about to kiss each other. And what you have to do is think of the orange as being a wall behind them. It's in the background. It is no longer part of the figure, it's part of the ground. And you'll see two Batmen, one on the left, one on the right, in profile, facing each other and trying to kiss each other. Next, we're going to discuss some of the organizing principles of perception based often on the environment in the natural world. In the natural world, vertical lines and horizontal lines are much more common. Now, obviously, these pictures have been selected because they're explicitly vertical, but we tend to perceive verticals and horizontals much more easily and quickly than any oblique lines. Oblique meaning something that's shifting off of vertical or horizontal. And so because verticals and horizontals are common properties in the physical world, our perceptual systems have adapted to that, and we tend to perceive verticals and horizontals more easily than any other orientation. Your brain has also learned how to make assumptions about light and shadow in the real world. So your perceptual systems typically assume that light is coming from above, because that's in the natural world, 99.9% of the time, that's where light comes from. It's coming from sort of above and around you. And so our perception of shadow can change our perception of objects. So, for example, we have two sort of objects here. One of them is shaded dark at the bottom and light at the top, and one of them is shaded dark at the top and light at the bottom. Now, if we're assuming that the light is coming from above, then the fact that the shadow is on the bottom of this left-hand object means that the object should be perceived as coming out of the screen, right? It looks like it's physically coming out of the screen, like you put a baseball on the screen, right? That thing it's popping out. Versus when the shadow's at the top of this object, and if light is coming from above, then what that means is this must be concave. It must be a dent, right? It must be going into the screen or the page. And so that's how you perceive this. You're more likely to perceive this one on the right as being like a divot, a hole, right? It was pressed in, versus the one on the left is popping out. And that's because of the way that you perceive light versus shadow and your brain's assumption that light comes from above. So here's a bit of an explanation of it. It breaks it down a little bit, why you see one being dented in and one versus coming out. So if the shadow is at the top, that's this guy on the right. If the shadow is at the top, then what must be happening is that you have a dent, because the light stops at the edge of that dent, and thus this piece ends up in shadow, whereas the bottom ends up highlighted. And the opposite is true. So if you have a bump coming out of the, let's call it the ground, the shadow will be produced on the bottom side of the bump because that is where the light cannot get to. So your brain sort of has this pre-programmed into it when it's looking at the outside world, such that this image on the left of footprints in the sand, right, looks like a concave. I think I'm getting that right. Concave and convex, right? Yes, this is concave. It's caved in. So this image of footprints in the sand looks concave as it actually is, right? That's the true image. But if we flip that image upside down, it starts to look convex. It looks like bubbles sort of coming out of the sand because now the light is coming from above the shadows are in different places because we have flipped the image upside down. So now it makes it look like the shadows at the bottom instead of at the top of each footprint, and thus you perceive them as bubbles coming out of the sand rather than footprints going into the sand. Now, we've discussed this a little bit as well previously when we talked about context, but we can also call this semantic regularities, meaning certain behaviors or actions or items tend to be carried out in different types of scenes. And so your knowledge of a scene, what we might call scene schema, is going to impact your expectation and thus your interpretation. So if you're looking at a jewelry case, you would be more likely to expect there to be diamond rings in the jewelry case and not a plate of fish and chips. So we have top-down versus bottom-up processing. This is sort of a little bit of a wrap-up here on top-down versus bottom-up. We have unconscious inference, environmental regularities. We didn't discuss Bayesian inference too much in this lecture. You can go to the textbook for that. Basically, it has to do with sort of the probabilistic assumptions that your brain is making about what's out there in the world. Your brain is considering prior information. It's then updating with new information being added to that prior information to make an inference about the world. And then we have bottom-up processing, which are these Gestalt organizing principles, which is a little counter to top-down, because remember, the Gestalt principles say that these are invariant, right? They are organizing principles that your brain applies to these data from the bottom up. You're not in control of the Gestalt principles. So they're an example of bottom-up processing. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit, talk a little bit about the brain, and how perception and action are linked together. So we know from our discussion of the brain in chapter 2 that you have neurons that respond best to things that in particular occur in the environment, or to say that a little more correctly, you have neurons that respond to particular things in the environment. This process can be called tuning. So these neurons become tuned to things that we commonly run into, like horizontals and verticals. This is called experience-dependent plasticity. This is basically how your brain learns what to expect from the outside world. Your neurons start to tune themselves to only firing for the color green or a vertical or a horizontal, for example. Experience-dependent plasticity. An example of this is an oddly named but quite important study using what are known as greebles. These are just weird, awkward, quasi face-like stimuli, right? This looks like a messed up chicken or something. They're kind of face-like, but I mean, they're definitely not faces, but they have some vague face-like properties. So what these researchers did was they showed people the greebles, this variety of these strange looking little figures. And they measured their FFA response. That's the fusiform face area. So we're talking about fMRI experiment here, measuring brain activity. They measured activity in the FFA, which is the little place in the brain that's used to perceive faces. And so we have two things going on here. The blue bars are the amount of activity in the FFA when shown the greebles. That's what these guys are called. And then the red bars are the amount of activity in the FFA when shown faces. So, not surprising, at first, when people are shown faces, their FFA is off the charts, right? Boom. That's what the FFA is for. It's for activating and processing face stimuli. And the greebles are kind of face-like. You get a little bit of activity in the FFA, but not much, right? There's not a whole lot going on here because these are not faces. But if you tell people that they need to name each of these figures its own specific name, so like this is Jim and this is Cindy and this is Tyler, right? And memorize which greeble is which so that they can recall the names of the greebles later. After you make them do this, their activity in their FFA changes. And suddenly their brain is treating the greebles like their faces. They're getting more activity to the greebles in that area. Notice that nothing about the greebles has changed. It's just that they prompted the participants to start treating the greebles as if they're individual distinct people or things by naming them. And by doing that, people had to start memorizing the quote-unquote facial features of each greeble in order to remember which one is named which. And thus you see increase activity in the FFA, meaning that the neurons in the FFA have experience-dependent plasticity. They can change their functioning with training and experience. So, a little bit about the connection between action or movement and perception, especially with vision, but even with sound as well. Our movement is a part of perception because as you move about the world, you're basically changing the input that your brain is getting because of the orientation of all the objects in the world around you. So as you move, what you basically do is create new little snapshots of all the stimuli in your world, like walking around this little cutout. This is probably metal, I would assume. This little sort of metal cutout of a horse, and how moving around it 360 degrees changes your perception of it and also adds more information to create a more accurate perception of what's going on here and what this is. So it's impossible to sort of disentangle your bodily movements from perception. And that's exactly what we find in the brain, because as soon as, for example, you perceive your morning cup of coffee, your brain already starts to produce activity that will lead to you taking an action, such as reaching for it. Just the very basic act of perceiving the coffee cup starts to get your brain ready to take an action. The two are intrinsically tied together. Think also about it in terms of maybe a reaction to something that's flying at you really quickly. So someone throws, you're at a park and there's some people off to the side and they're just throwing a football back and forth, having a good time. One of them accidentally shanks the football. They shank the throw and it's coming right at your head. And at the last minute, you sort of catch it out of the corner of your eye. You perceive the football, and that perception is immediately followed by an action of you maybe ducking your head, covering your head with your hands, reaching out to hit the football to bounce it away from you, right? The action is intrinsically tied with the very nature of the perception. You can't disentangle the two. Now, part of this is due to these two separate pathways of perceptual and action information in your brain. We're going to call them the what pathway and the where pathway. The what pathway is a pathway of activity through the brain that helps you identify objects. It helps you name them and understand what they are. It's called the ventral pathway because it goes from, when we're talking about vision, it goes from your occipital lobe at the back of the brain, sort of around the side of your head by your ears through the temporal lobe, because this is in the ventral direction, right? It's off to the sort of underside. And not surprisingly, this is the what pathway because your temporal lobe is associated with language. So the processing that's happening in the temporal lobe is about being able to name these objects, identify them, and then understand their properties. You have another pathway of information in the brain that runs from, let's again say with vision, from the occipital lobe, where you're processing visual information, up through the top of the head, and what we call the dorsal pathway. This goes through the parietal lobe. And if you remember from chapter 2, the parietal lobe is involved with processing movement. And so this dorsal pathway helps us to determine the location of objects. Now, what does the location of an object have to do with movement? Well, like I just said with the example of a football, that where pathway is determining not that it's a football. It's just going, okay, where is that thing? What's the location? Because location is the number one important variable in determining whether you need to move. If the football is 30 yards away from you, you don't need to move. So your perception of its location informs you that you don't need to move. That's why this goes through the parietal lobe. But if you perceive the location of the football to be 2 feet away from you, then what do you need to do? You need to move. You need to do something. Duck your head, tuck your shoulder, right? Put your hands up. You got to do something. So this location-based perception is sort of tied into your movement areas of the brain. So the ventral pathway starts in the occipital lobe for visual information and moves down the temporal lobe over here to the side. And the dorsal pathway starts at the occipital lobe and moves up through the parietal lobe. And so, for example, if you were to remove someone's temporal lobe or a big enough piece of their temporal lobe, they can't identify which object is which. But if someone removes the parietal lobe, then a person is going to have difficult time determining the location of an object, even though they can tell you what the object is. So this is another example of double dissociation in neuroscience and cognitive psychology. You might also want to think of these two pathways as like the perception pathway. I don't like this necessarily because the whole thing is perception. But if you need another way of remembering it, what right corresponds to perception? What is that thing? Action corresponds to where. You could also call this the how pathway. And here they are again, right? The what pathway, the ventral pathway, and then the where or how pathway, the dorsal pathway up through the parietal lobe. And lastly, last slide of the lecture, mirror neurons. These were all the rage 10 to 15 years ago, or maybe 15 to 20 years ago. They were first discovered, and they really changed our understanding of the neuroscience of perception, because it turns out you have neurons that fire when you see something and then when you do that same thing. I'll say that again. You have neurons, in fact, a whole system of these neurons, that what they do is they fire when you see an action, and then those same neurons fire when you perform that action. So you have some neurons that would fire to someone doing jumping jacks, right? You're perceiving someone else doing jumping jacks, and then some of those same neurons would also fire when you do jumping jacks yourself. Not that you're watching someone doing jumping jacks, but you are taking that action. You're doing the jumping jacks. So think of this as the monkey see, monkey do system. And in fact, that analogy is probably a pretty good representation of what these neurons are for. They probably evolved for imitation, right? To imitate what you see other people doing. That's how, especially children, learn a lot about the world and what they need to do, how they need to do it. They watch other people, they watch adults, they watch older children. And so this mirror neuron system is going to play a huge role in the reciprocal relationship between perceiving, watching someone do something, and then acting, doing it yourself. All right. Thanks, everybody. This is the end of chapter 3. Check back in for chapter 4, which will be about attention. Thanks, and I will talk to you later.